So we're good to go. And as you can see, my proposal for today's session is to continue talking about the theme we began last week, which has to do with the foreign policy of the second Trump administration. Somewhat provocatively, I raised the question last week, does Trump really have a foreign policy? And my answer was that there is an overarching umbrella to the Trump foreign policy, which can be described, I think, succinctly as America first, but that the policy-making process to generate a coherent set of strategies and to adjust them to the conditions of the world in which you're pursuing those strategies does not appear to be in place. And so we have seen in the last couple of days the publication of the national security strategy of the United States that Donald Trump put out to guide his second administration. And I think, again, it is quite clear that this is not what I would consider to be a coherent, well thought through, and strategically adapted uh, vision of both America's goals and how to accomplish them in the world in the second quarter of the 21st century. And I'll say this very quickly. I think that part of the question is which portions of the Trump administration generated this document or are in charge of his foreign policy. We've seen this quite clearly and I think somewhat painfully in particular the negotiations of a peace plan for the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and the way in which Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and by extension the State Department, have been marginal in the original drafting of that strategy, that it appears that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, but also Vladimir Putin and his representatives were first to that plan, and that only later were the Ukrainians, the Europeans, but also the American diplomats given an opportunity to revise a plan that was already in place. And this does not speak to a particularly coherent policymaking process. It also doesn't speak to a policymaking process that allows the right considerable apparatus that the United States has in its national security agencies and in its Department of State, tremendous expertise, information processing or intelligence processing capacities, analysis capacities, that all of that was shunted to the side in favor of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, two people whose background is in real estate, who don't speak the language of the region they're intervening in, who don't seem to have a deep understanding of the culture, the politics, or the places where the United States might have leverage. And so I'll say this very quickly. Donald Trump's background is in real estate. Steve Witkoff's background is in real estate. Jared Kushner's background is in real estate. And that there is a simplicity to real estate deals, right? A simplicity to do with the fact that they are potentially win-win transactions where both sides see mutual advantage, whereas there's no win-win solution to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Everything that Russia gains occurs at Ukraine's expense, right? And in addition to that, right, where there's a kind of simple metric through which advantage and disadvantage are calculated, profit and loss, which can be easily monetized. The idea that, in a sense, the megalomaniacal ambitions of Vladimir Putin know probably no limit and have only one metric, which has to do with the expansion of Mother Russia and the maintenance of his personal autocratic power over his people, are totally incommensurable, those interests, with the interests of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership, which is primarily in preserving their own territorial integrity, right? Grasping that kind of conflict, and then the nature of America's interests in this conflict, which I don't think are exclusively in peace. I do think that we should want bloodshed to end wherever we can bring that about. But there are other values that need to be considered in addition to ending fighting, right? And those have to do with the likelihood of future war. If you appease aggression, then aggressors tend, this is not just the lesson of Hitler in Europe, but I think a long-standing lesson of international relations, aggressors tend to be encouraged to continue to try to aggrandize their territory through further aggression. And so, assuming we don't just want to end the current conflict, but to also deter future conflicts, then the set of considerations is broader still. And then, assuming that we also want to promote certain kinds of government because they are less likely to be aggressive, but also because they are better for their people and better for international relations as a whole, and thereby ultimately better for the United States, both in terms of our values and our narrower material interests. I think many of these considerations have been pushed to the side in the initial stages of these negotiations, and this reflects the fact that the policy-making apparatus in the Trump administration has been given over to people who lack expertise, and of course that starts at the top. Donald Trump is himself a real estate man, is a man who appears to have very little patience or appetite for learning about the complexities of world politics or the regions and theaters in which the United States is active or conflicts are currently occurring, right? He's been described as a person who doesn't really read, whose attention span for the things he's not interested in is a couple of minutes long, and who tends to absorb information much more readily from social media and Fox News than from intelligence briefings. And this means, right, that this administration is being guided by a man who is not delegating to those who have genuine expertise, but who is also more confident in his own intelligence and insight, is right committed to the idea that he has the power to make the world bend to match the frames of analysis that he is most comfortable with. And I'm sorry to say, Vladimir Putin looks at him and says, "Thank you very much. This is exactly the kind of person who, right, the KGB 30 years ago when Putin was starting his career, had an easy playbook on how to manipulate." And so, again, the question, does Donald Trump have a foreign policy? And here I would suggest, if by foreign policy we mean a, right, policy that is constructed around clear-cut goals and has strategies to implement those goals and adjust those strategies according to the complexities of the actors with whom we have to pursue those goals. No, the United States does not have a foreign policy, and the recent national security strategy, I think, makes this all the more clear. Today, in addition to extending beyond what we began with last week, thinking about Venezuela and the attacks on boats in the Caribbean and the U.S. intervention in the right campaign in Honduras, which I believe is still technically tied and undecided, although Donald Trump keeps trying to intervene in the politics of Honduras to tilt the outcome for some reason to his preferred candidate. Having said all that, right, I want to pull back And I want to ask a little bit more systematically and analytically about the conditions of world politics in the 21st century. And here I want to raise not only the narrow question of whether or not Donald Trump's foreign policy is adequately tailored to succeed in these conditions, but also more generally about whether or not the American foreign policy establishment is pivoting to what I think of as the most important challenges of the 21st century, and at the same time, whether or not our entire approach to accumulating and using power still works in the altered conditions of the second quarter of the 21st century. And so I start with a simple question, which I'm sure you can anticipate the answer to. Can America first replace Pax Americana? And so, right, the idea of Pax Americana comes out of Pax Romana, out of the idea that a dominant hegemon in world politics, or at least in a large portion of the world, can secure a kind of peace through its dominance if it uses its power to actually try to keep the world both at peace and more or less integrated. And that the Romans maybe did that for several centuries, and that arguably the United States has tried to do that since the end of World War II. And I say arguably, I think actually the reality is much more complicated than that. But I hope maybe to share a little bit of data with you by the end of today's class, in which we look at the fact that in particular, from the period from roughly 1990 to roughly 2010, right? And please note, right, this is a period in which the United States launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and also encouraged very deadly conflicts in Syria and Libya, in which, right, there was a lot of conflict in various places in Africa, the unraveling of the former Yugoslavia. This was not a peaceful period. But if we look at it in terms of metrics to do with the level of casualties in war, both international and civil, it is actually the case that casualties came down substantially during the Cold War and then during the period of Pax Americana, right? So that period comes to an end roughly a decade ago, and what we're seeing is casualties on the rise again. And so Pax Americana has ended. Does America first represent an alternative strategy here? And my simple, straightforward, not very charitable suggestion is absolutely not. That Pax Americana is, I'm sorry, that America first is a completely nostalgic, frankly, somewhat magical thinking kind of approach to foreign policy. And to appreciate why I reached that conclusion, I want to survey some of the complexities that face the United States in the global order in the world today, or maybe I should say the global disorder of the world today. So the old order has ended, right? The period, the short period in which we went from bipolar, the United States and the Soviet bloc, as the two major allegiances in world politics, and as a structuring frame that lent world politics a great deal of order, also posed grave levels of danger, because you had, right, two major powers pointing large arsenals of nuclear weapons at each other. It's frankly somewhat miraculous that we avoided nuclear war. I will just note, right, that to the extent that we avoided nuclear war, it was in large part due to, right, the way in which the bipolar competition structured the, right, incentives of the two blocs to avoid conflict. Excuse me. And that We have in the world today nearly as many nuclear weapons as we had at the height of world of the Cold War. And by the way, in some sense, counting those numbers of weapons is beside the point, right? We have more than enough, right? Probably 100-fold more weapons than we need to um, destroy the biosphere, to fundamentally disrupt biological life on the planet. We now know if some small fraction of those weapons go off, the amount of ash and debris, smoke that they will put into our stratosphere will result in a nuclear winter akin to when the meteor struck the planet Earth that ended the dinosaurs' reign, that this would be a catastrophic event. And by the way, we no longer have a bi or unipolar world, a world in which there are two major powers or the United States is the main power. Today, we live in a multipolar world. And I'll say this very quickly. The transition, right, happened very fast, and it happened primarily, I think, because on the one hand, the United States um, invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and in so doing revealed itself as capable of taking out state-based militaries, but incapable of imposing its will on the populations of the territories it conquered. And so the limits of our power were very rapidly revealed. But having said that, it's not just that we've returned to a world in which, right, China in Asia, Russia in Europe, maybe Nigeria in Africa, maybe Venezuela in Latin America, where there are multiple powers, none of whom sees any reason not to act aggressively in its own region. That's one big aspect of the world that I think our foreign policy needs to be taking into account. We may still dream magically of being the largest power in the world. We have the largest economy. We have the most expensive and most technologically advanced military. Our culture has the greatest influence in the world. Our system of government was, until at least quite recently, the model that many people in the world aspired to, but that does not translate into a capacity to impose our will on actors in the world that don't want to cooperate with us. And so that's one aspect of this world. But I want to emphasize another aspect very quickly. And I think if you think about the period from 1989 to 2025, and you compare that roughly third of a century to any other period in human history, there have been more changes, especially technological changes, that have disrupted international or world politics than there have been in any comparable period that I'm aware of in human history, right? So in 1989, we have the Cold War as opposed to multipolar politics. But in 1989, the internet is still just barely getting started. We don't have smartphones. We don't have social media. And by the way, we certainly don't have a globally interconnected economy. China is just beginning to industrialize. Artificial intelligence is something that you read about in science fiction books. Climate change is something that scientists are concerned about, but that most politicians don't think of as particularly urgent. And so in each of those right domains that I've just mentioned, the world has undergone a vast transformation. And I would just add to that the degree of global interconnection economically, the speed at which goods and people and ideas and influence, right, transverses the world. This is a totally different world that we live in 2025 than it was in 1989. But I do think that there's a certain inertia in American foreign policy thinking that hasn't fully digested and pivoted to the new world we live in. So, right, beginning with the transition back to multi-power politics, part of what this has done is allowed Hamas, Putin, Iran, China, other bad actors to see greater freedom for action in a world that has much less capacity to enforce rules, norms, and order on them. And so this is reflected in Hamas's attack on Israel. It's also reflected on the way in which Israel responds to that attack and its right total disregard for the norms of war, whether those are international norms or the IDF's own norms. It's reflected obviously in Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but it is also reflected in the way in which China, North Korea, Iran have given state sponsorship to forms of cybercrime, right? Spreading malware that works to ransom, right, the ability of large corporations, municipal and non-governmental entities to control their own data, right? The effort to hack in and capture the technological infrastructure that makes modern firms and large-scale organizations function. This is part of the bad actor right scenario where these countries now feel complete liberty to sponsor, right, and profit from various forms of cybercrime and cyberterrorism. And by the way, it's not just that, right? The idea that they are also sponsoring informational attacks on societies with open public spheres. That in right the media system in which social media play an outsized role. And, I suspect that most of us in this conversation today don't actually participate in that media system. But please note, right, that the majority of people under 40 do primarily get their news from social media, that large portions of the American media ecosystem have their agenda set for them by social media, even if they are themselves broadcast media systems. And that in that media system, right, the majority of content is probably generated by AI, and it's really difficult to discern what is and isn't, and how much of that content is produced by other countries, very often, right, either state or state affiliated organizations that are deliberately camouflaging their origin, trying to appear as if they're domestic actors, and trying to influence our politics in certain ways. I'll say something that is obvious, and yet I don't think we maybe fully digest its significance. It's impossible to know, but I think there's a reasonable chance that Donald Trump would never have been elected president in 2016 if it weren't for Russian interference in the American election using these mechanisms, right? And so the whole conversation we're having today, I assume Donald Trump would not be president in 2025 if he had not been elected in 2016. The whole conversation we're having today might be the product of one of the most successful foreign influence operations in the history of the world, or to put it differently, one of the most destructive attacks on the United States in our history is the current president is the product of that attack. That gives you, I hope, a sense both of the nature of the new domain of international politics, how different this is from the old world order in which we were concerned about missiles or proxy wars or espionage. This is just a totally different playing field. And by the way, in this playing field, then, right, Putin has invaded Ukraine. Trump has imposed tariffs on almost every country in the world. And together, those two actions are a frontal assault on the pillars that support the system of international law and norms, both in the realm of security and in the realm of economic order. They are both clearly illegal according to international law, right? Not just the invasion of Ukraine, which is an attack on the most fundamental principle, the territorial integrity of sovereign states, but also the tariffs, which is an attack on the World Trade Organization and various bilateral agreements that are meant to govern trade. And neither of these orders has proved strong enough to prevent the assault. And the result is that they now are deeply injured, weakened, shown to be ineffective, and therefore are not going to deter further actions of this kind by other actors, especially what I'm calling bad actors. And in saying this, I mean that these are people who, right, repress their own populations, terrorize other countries, but also whose interests clearly do not align with the interests of the United States. And so multipolar politics has resumed in this very different world in which digital and financial interconnectivity can be weaponized, while the kind of media that we have make the old model of international relations in which nation states are represented by their leaders, and generally the decisions that those leaders make determine the relations between states, an outmoded, right, almost quaint model for thinking about international politics. We add to that then the asymmetrical vulnerability of open societies, right? Societies like ours that have a First Amendment or a norm or constitutional principle of freedom of speech and freedom of press find it much more difficult to regulate the influx of potential foreign influence and the way in which it cascades through our public spheres. And so the idea that we are economically and technologically interconnected and that those present new vulnerabilities, new possibilities for weaponization is part of, I think, the big challenge of the 21st century, and another place where America first, in a sense, just puts its head in the sands and wishes away the level of interconnectivity, wishes that we could somehow fortress America and return to a world in which we are in control of our own institutions and can use them to leverage the rest of the world. That is not the world in which we live in. And if, right, American foreign policy is premised fundamentally on a fantasy, on magical thinking, then we should expect that it will fail and that the latitude for action of our rivals, our enemies, people who want the world to operate in ways that are adverse to our interests, whether those interests are material interests or the interests of our values, that this is, right, not going to work in this world. And so the breakdown in order that I'm describing occurs against the backdrop of much greater interdependence, vulnerability, and hence a much greater need for cooperation. Um, Cybercrime, I've already discussed a little bit, right? Increasingly leveraged by state actors as a way of, among other things, generating revenues. The degree of North Korean penetration of, right, American corporations is, I think, something that we have only a very loose grasp on, but it appears that it's one of the chief sources of revenue for the North Korean state. The idea that terrorism, though not top of the agenda right now is, I think, a constant threat in this world. The idea that pandemics and migration, artificial intelligence, and climate change are all related to the degree of mobility and interconnectedness, that this is physical as well as technological, and that there's just no way to manage the distinct threat vectors that each one of these developments represents in a go it alone, prioritize the nation policy. Right? It just doesn't work because the locus of action of the nation state is its own territory. The dimensions of the problems we face far exceed the territory we control. And if we don't have some capacity to act in concert with other societies, then we are just helpless to address any one of those extremely urgent problems, threats, potentially existential threats to our society, but to humanity, maybe even biological life on the planet as a whole. And so let me not go through this very quickly. I will just say instead that the various lenses, the policy apparatus of the American foreign policy establishment um, are poor resources for managing this entirely and rapidly altered and quickly changing world. That this requires a kind of nimbleness, a kind of fresh thinking that I think would challenge the most adaptable foreign policy establishment. And the United States does not have that. And so before we get to America first, I think you look at the Biden administration and you say, well, in certain respects on AI, on climate change, maybe on pandemics, it was trying to forge new paths, trying to begin to be innovative in thinking through new strategies, but it was probably not moving quickly enough to keep up with the nature of these problems. And in other areas, especially migration, right, it was very flat-footed. And so it would be one thing to say, if we were really focused on the range of problems and the kinds of methods necessary to actually adjust to the very rapidly changing and dangerous new world, then we would still be deeply challenged. But the idea that what we have done post Biden in the first year of the second Trump administration is just to discard altogether our expertise and to pretend that the problems we face are not the problems that we need to address, means that we enter, the second quarter of the 21st century looking backwards as opposed to looking forwards, trying to reimpose the right methods and approach to policy, the strategy that was maybe well suited to the middle of the 20th century, but not to the middle of the 21st century. So, with that in mind, let me just spend a couple minutes on the national security strategy. And for those of you who haven't followed this was just published on Thursday. This is a document that is typically published by a new administration around its first year in power. And it's a document that is meant to synthesize its understanding of what its priorities are with its foreign policy, as well as what the challenges are that are facing the United States in the world today. And so let me just make my way through the bullet points under what I think is probably the most important overview section of this document. What does the United States want in and from the world, right? And note that the first point focuses on the Western Hemisphere. We want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable and well governed enough to prevent and discourage mass migration to the United States. And then later in that same paragraph, right, the document refers to the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, right? If you remember the Monroe Doctrine, right, from 130 odd years ago, right, this is the idea that this is our hemisphere. Europe may be dominant in its hemisphere. Who knows who's going to be dominant in Asia? But in the Western hemisphere, in, right, the Americas, the United States is the dominant power, and we want to have free reign to do what we want in our backyard, right? And the Trump corollary is to focus primarily on migration, but also to focus on so-called narco-terrorists and cartels, national criminal organizations, right? And here we see, I think, a clear alignment between the Trump domestic and foreign policy. The idea that migration is the major threat to the United States. We're about to see that they believe this is true for Europe as well, that this is a kind of Christian nationalist ideology, which is now no longer just the stuff of campaign rhetoric, but apparently the stuff of, right, the national security doctrine of the United States. That we believe we can exercise unilateral control over the Western Hemisphere strikes me as deeply delusional and aggrandizing. But more, I think, important, or at least equally important to that, is the idea of just how deeply confused this policy is. So we have a policy of trying to close off migration and trying to shut down much of the importation of manufactured goods to the United States in order to promote, on the one hand, right, the preservation of the culture of the United States as a dominantly European Christian Protestant culture. And on the other hand, an effort to keep imported goods out of the American economy in order to redirect the domestic economy to produce more goods, right? And so it seems to me that in a sense you've got the pillars of America first. When you look at those two policies, they have domestic as well as international faces to them. And the idea that they just don't make much sense empirically. That the studies which we've looked at together in the past of the net contribution of immigrants to the American economy being roughly $2 trillion a year, right? If we really succeed, as it appears we are, in making the prospects for, right, actually being viable as a migrant to the United States in the United States in 2025 so dismal, right? It just looks like a terribly hostile place to come to. People stop coming, large numbers are deported, and the result is, well, a 9% decline in manufacturing in the United States. Inflation beginning to come back as opposed to going down, and a contraction in hiring and in consumption, all of which occurring not during a recessionary period, but during a period of, at least as far as we can tell, modest economic growth, right? So the idea that we are damaging ourselves through this policy, I think, is extremely important to notice. But then the question of whether or not, right, we can sustain a traditional culture, a right white or European Christian culture in the United States by preventing people from other countries entering our society, I think fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the threat to that culture. And in saying that, I'm not entirely disagreeing that we should be concerned about preserving that culture against overly rapid transformation. But I will say that the threat is from within as much as from without. And in saying that, what I mean is that the problem is not just that people are arriving from other countries. Please note actually that the pews of Catholic churches are filled with Latin Americans. And this is true, by the way, of certain Pentecostalist and other evangelical faiths as well, that actually the real decline in religiosity in the United States is primarily from European Americans. And so the idea that if you just keep those others out, somehow, right, will sustain our traditional culture is as much magical thinking as is the idea that if you keep imports out, somehow we will restore our industrial economy. These are
Yeah,
bad ideas. Bad ideas make bad policy,
yeah,
and they're in the very first goal of the new national security strategy are ideas thought through, right, on the basis of a bunch of misunderstandings. By the way, again, to just revisit what we talked about last week, the idea that we should want to, right, prevent the inflow of narcotics and crime through transnational criminal organizations into the United States seems absolutely right to me. The idea that we're going to do that by putting our finger on the scale of an election in Honduras or by blowing up fishing vessels in the Caribbean is just pure fantasy, right? And so again, this is not a well thought through foreign policy from bottom to top, right? From goal to worldview to strategy to implementation. It's really not making sense. We want to halt and reverse ongoing damage that foreign actors inflict on the American economy while keeping the Indo-Pacific free and open, preserving freedom of navigation in all crucial sea lanes, and maintaining secure and reliable supply chains and access to critical materials, right? And so again, really speaking out of both sides of the mouth, we don't want the imports that damage our economy, but we do want exports to be able to go to the rest of the world and imports of the things that we need. And let me just be as clear about this as possible. What don't you see mentioned on this page, right? The most important, right, statement of our goals. You don't see China. You don't see Asia. As close as you get is Indo-Pacific, right? And the idea that China, and by the way, Russia and North Korea and Iran have to be looking at this and saying, if this is really the strategy, and I want to be as clear as possible because our foreign policy apparatus is so disorganized and incoherent. I don't know if I should be paying that much attention to this document or not. Maybe this is just J.D. Vance's pet project, and it's not really going to have any influence on the actual foreign policy of the United States, which depends on who the last person who spoke to Donald Trump was and what he put on social media last night. I'm not sure, but if you're in China or Russia and you believe that these are the priorities of the United States, you're probably looking at it and saying, wow, we have free and complete latitude to act. Not a single mention, right, of trying to contain the rise of China, trying to figure out how to manage the emerging hegemon in Asia and how to structure our relationship with it. Instead, just let's keep those navigation lines open, but keep their goods out of our country. By the way, no mention whatsoever of Taiwan. And the idea, of course, that the chips, the microprocessors that make our technological world function can be cut off very quickly via a Chinese blockade of Taiwan. Are we saying we don't really care that much about it? Third priority, we want to support our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe while restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity. And I think if you looked at that, quickly and naively, you might say, oh, well, we want to support Europe. This is us acting as their allies. But I think if you understand what this language is saying, right, it's saying that the European leaders don't understand Europe's interests as well as J.D. Vance and the other Christian nationalists in the administration do, that their real interest is in keeping Europe European and keeping European civilization Christian, right? And that the idea of that Europe is in grave threat of being overwhelmed by migration and is surrendering its own national identities, and that the United States, as its third most important goal in the world, is getting European right-wing nationalists greater power in Europe. Again, it's baffling in addition to being nauseating for the priorities that it reflects this administration has. It makes no sense as a foreign policy. We want to prevent an adversarial power from dominating the Middle East, its oil and gas supplies and choke points through which they pass, and avoiding forever wars, right? This is clearly directed at Iran. And by the way, one of the things that this document says is we should stop hectoring the right kingdoms or the right Saudis, essentially, the rich oil magnates of the Middle East should be given permission to do what they want to do. There's very little talk of human rights at all in the document. And so I just want to be as clear as possible, right? This is a very different kind of foreign policy that the United States has had for really the last 100 years. And I just hope that it's not really the document that's going to inform our foreign policy, but it does indicate the level of disarray, I think, in the American foreign policy world right now. Let me just return for a moment to what we talked about last week as an illustration of this, the attack on Venezuelan boats, the naval buildup around Venezuela, and then, right, the idea that since those boats don't send a significant amount of cocaine or any fentanyl, the reporter for the Washington Post who broke the story of Hegseth or his admiral ordering a second strike on the first boat we attacked when there were defenseless people left clinging to wreckage in order to kill them. An absolutely clear war crime and potentially just a violation of domestic law, a simple murder, if you will, right? The reporter who broke that story, when asked about whether or not there's any chance that Venezuelan boats are carrying fentanyl, he said it's more likely that they're carrying marshmallows than fentanyl. There's just not a pathway seaborne on small boats for fentanyl from Venezuela to the United States. So what are the objectives of this policy? And here I want to say, in the first instance, in the way that Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine indicates, it's a return to neocolonialism in Venezuela and Latin America, to promoting regime change because we don't like left-wing populism, we want right-wing populism, and in particular promoting regime change in a country with vast oil reserves that we would like to give our companies access to. And by the way, again, part of that national security strategy focuses on using American power to give American corporations access to the resources of the countries with which we interact. The second interpretation of the other objectives is promoting right-wing populism as a global American policy. And this is just, I think clear before that document was published, now even more clear. But the third, and I think the most important thing I want to emphasize here, right, is that this is an administration populated by Fox News personalities, right? Pete Hegseth, but literally 30 high-level people in the Trump administration come out of the Fox News universe. And never mind, right, that's a network that had to pay nearly, right, $750 million for lying to its viewers about the outcome of the 2020 election. It is a network that thrives in the world of optics and images. And so it appears that what we're doing in our foreign policy is primarily projecting optics of a muscular country that can blow ships out of the water whenever it wants to. I'm sorry, boats. They're not even ships, right? And that this is a way of displaying that we are finally getting serious about interdicting drugs. Never mind that they're more likely to be marshmallows than fentanyl. And that, in a sense, the optics matter more than the long-term efficacy of the policy. That the foreign policy of the United States is being made for the consumption of viewers on right-wing social media and Fox News, and not for the long-term, carefully considered strategic interests of the United States, I think reflects the way in which policy is being made, the people who are making it as well. So let me transition at the very end here to Ukraine. And I'm going to have to be brief about this, but right, Russian attacks are intensifying, negotiations are underway, although the deadline has passed, and it appears they're frankly at a stalemate at this point, right? Ukraine will not accept a plan dictated by Russia. Russia will not accept anything other than its fantasy. And meanwhile, right, people are dying by the thousands on the front lines, and the United States is not just in its peace plan, but in its material foreign policy, in dismantling the technology controls that kept Russia from getting access to the technology it now has access to, and is now using and now gaining ground in Ukraine, and therefore emboldened to keep fighting, right? That this is what the Trump administration did in its first months, and that the Trump administration is also withholding from Ukraine the weapons that it needs. Having said all of that, right, I think this is clearly going to result in this war, this terrible, brutal, costly, deadly war of attrition continuing, right? And to be as clear as possible, I know there are narratives coming out of the theater right now that say the Ukraine is losing, and I think that that is absolutely accurate, right? But if you look at the actual gains of Russia in the last few months, they are very small, right? And the pace at which they're gaining territory is not a pace that would allow it to accomplish its aims in the next 2 or 3 years, right? So Russia has to fight a punishing war, right? The front line, which stretches over 1,000 miles, is really a very porous front line. It goes maybe 15 miles in both directions, in part because the form of warfare here is primarily drone warfare as opposed to conventional artillery, and that means the front line shifts very quickly. The term that's being used to refer to this very extended war area is the meat grinder, and that's because troops who enter this area are very often wounded or killed, primarily via drone warfare. And so if we look at, right, the extent of the Russian equipment loss, right, and it's just stunning, right? And Russia clearly does have a material superiority over Ukraine, as well as an economic and demographic advantage, sizable advantage in this conflict. But having said that, I also think it's important to notice, right? If you compare where Russia is with the proposed lines from the Russian sponsored peace plan, essentially they were trying to get through the negotiated settlement of this conflict, this large swath of territory. I hope you can see, right? The red or pink areas are the areas that Russia currently controls. The black lines, well, that's the totality of the Donetsk and right, Zaporia region. The alternative terminology here is the Donab, right? But the large region that Russia wants to control in eastern Ukraine, and it doesn't currently control, sorry, is where they proposed to draw the lines on their settlement map. So getting by a treaty what might take them 3 brutal years to get via military means. And by the way, Steve Witkoff and, all right, Kushner signed off on this proposal and sent it to the Ukrainians and the Europeans. It has to say to the other side, well, we've got to placate, we've got to humor Donald Trump because we want the United States weapons to support us. We want the United States not to actively side with the Russians, but boy, are they unserious at best or completely captured by Russian interests at worst. So I want to say, right, I've got a couple headlines on the board here. Sergei Radchenko's recent publication in Foreign Affairs, America's magical thinking about Ukraine. A bad deal is worse than no deal because it's just going to whet Putin's appetite for further aggression. Thomas Friedman's recent op-ed, The Useful Idiots from America, whom Putin is playing like a flute. I think it's quite clear that this is just an unserious initiative. So our embrace of Putin's wish list and, right, Witkoff's coaching of Putin and how to keep Trump from giving the important Sidewinder missiles and the other, right, missiles that Ukraine desperately needs by flattering Donald Trump's ego shows the incoherence of American foreign policy making. It's emboldened Russia. It's set off alarms in Europe, and that we have dismantled the leverage that Ukraine could use to maybe settle this war in a way that doesn't cause it to go on for another year, 2 year, 3 years. That the result is Russia's slow gains across a broad front, but at this very steep cost, including not only Russian lives and equipment, but, right, out of control inflation, very high interest rates, cratering economic productivity, and a very, very dangerous brain drain in the Russian economy. And so I just think that the narrative that seems to support the Trump position on this, which is that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, is only half the picture. The other half of the picture is that, yes, Russia's making advances, but the costs are so steep, it's not clear how much longer the Russian regime can bear this. And Putin is very good at projecting strength. And apparently, Trump is very susceptible to that form of manipulation. But those of us watching from the outside shouldn't fall into that trap. And so let me stop there, open this up for discussion. Again, I hope this is helpful. We have been so focused on domestic policy in our conversations together. I wanted to try to bring us up to speed. I know there's a lot of material. I haven't talked about climate change or artificial intelligence at all. I will try to do that in talks to come. But who wants to start us out with a question or a thought for today? Go ahead, Anne. Hi, nice to see you.
Good morning, everyone. My concern, well, among others, is that Russia's fighting, well, not fighting, but threatening its other border countries. There's been lots of activity, damage here, damage there. It's not war yet, but they're really pushing.
Yeah, testing, I would say, right?
Yeah.
The invading the airspace of Poland or Estonia or even I think Sweden, right? I mean, and so the idea, yes, that I don't know how much Putin actually is exploring the possibility of widening the conflict zone. I certainly hope he isn't right now, because as I say, the damage to the Russian military, the damage to the Russian economy, the loss of life on the part of Russian troops, all of this has generated, I think, real danger to Putin. And I think, although he projects this bellicose persona and confidence when dealing with the United States and outsiders, he probably has some sense. It's hard to know because, right, of course, the kind of tyrant that he is typically surrounded by people who just flatter him. But I assume he must have some sense that there's some genuine fragility, and the last thing he needs is another front in this war, especially against a NATO country, right, where it would then be war against all of Europe. But having said that, the idea, as I see it, that what Putin is doing is in essence saying to the Europeans, stay out, right? Stay back. I have the power to damage you, to pull you into a broader war. And so you need to let me do the damage I want to do in my own backyard. That's the way I read that, Ann. But I think that's 2025. I think if, right, in 2026, there's a peace deal that gives Russia basically everything it wanted in this war. And then 2027, 2028, Russia resumes, right, building up its military and its economy. Please note, among other factors, right now, the price of oil is much lower than it was a couple of years ago. And of course, Russia is a petrostate. That's its primary export. And so Russia is weakened in that regard as well. Say the price of oil goes back up, right? Then I think your worry is spot on. 2 years from now, 3 years from now, if Russia has successfully, right, increased its territory and its resources through aggression against its neighbor, what's to stop it from doing it again? And whether that's in, right, the Ukraine again, or in Poland, or in Estonia, or even further south, I don't know. But yes, I think you're absolutely right to be worried about that, and that intelligent foreign policy would be taking into account the need to not just end this war, but to deter future aggression, to make this sufficiently costly for Putin that he does not conclude on the basis of what's happened in Ukraine that this is a rewarding enterprise for him in Russia. Thank you, Ann. Good comment. Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in? Hi, Flossie. Go ahead.
I'm worried about uh, um, the way a lot of people are making money by selling a strange kind of real estate or actually buying apartment houses and dividing the usual apartment into pod things where they rent out a bed and a mattress and another bed and another mattress for something like $700 rent. It is just kind of madness. So money doesn't make sense anymore. You don't know what costs what and why it should. And we're losing the middle class that had some sense of reality. We're going bananas. That's what I perceive.
Thank you, Flossie, and you're pulling me back into domestic politics, and I'm going to resist for today at least, and I do think the idea that we have a deep affordability crisis in the United States, and that housing costs is among the things that's really driving it is worthy of returning to. I think by the end of the month I'll be back to talking about that, but in the meantime. Let me talk about the fact that, right, the Trump administration's foreign policy seems to be, in many respects, authored by real estate magnates who seem to be more interested in securing profitable real estate deals for themselves than they are in America's long-term strategic or value interests, right? And so I think there's a corollary to what you're saying in the place I focused on today. And I'll just say this very quickly. When you read that national security strategy document, it's all about the U.S. using its power in order to allow its corporations unfettered or advantageous access to foreign markets and foreign resources, right? It's kind of putting into a written strategy document the kind of foreign policy the United States had in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, but in a sense, we had the good graces not to actually say it out loud, right? And so the idea that this is a kind of nakedly economically predatory policy that goes under the label America First, I just find it to be deeply, deeply disconcerting, but also just fundamentally flawed because, frankly, in doing this, we are going to damage the institutions that are, frankly, the bedrock of American wealth creation, our integration into the global economy. Again, I don't want to suggest that that's altogether a good thing, right? Whether we're talking about climate change or inequality or human trafficking, there's a lot of stuff to work on. But the idea that the right approach is to turn a blind eye to all that stuff and just focus on enriching our country via our foreign policy seems to me to be profoundly confused. Thank you, Flossie, for right getting the seed planted for the next topic, but also for helping us to think through some of these other issues. Anybody else for today? Hi,
David,
go ahead. I
um,
was looking at Cy waving his hand. Jonathan, can you
oh,
wait a moment?
sorry, David, say that again.
I'm asking you to wait a moment so Cy
Oh,
can speak
sure, of
first.
course.
Go ahead, Cy. Um,
Uh, I'd like
go,
to introduce my brother-in-law, Dr. William Karp, who has a question.
please go ahead, William. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I totally see the point you're making about these realtors changing our priorities and shifting the focus entirely to an economic one, as opposed to any spread of democracy, which was, I think, also pointed out in a Times article in the last day or two. Along those lines, we saw all these departments, the restructuring of them, the omission of them, the ruination of them, and we were able to look back and see that this all had its, I don't say birth, but at least its description in this Project 2025 with the Heritage Foundation, and secondarily, or as part of that, we were able to ascribe it to a lot of it to Russell Vogt, and I think quite accurately. Looking at the national security strategy document, I just get that I see some vague reference to how the Department of Defense contributes to it, this group contributes to it, et cetera. Are there any more? Do you know any more of the specifics of the actual people who were the contributing authors to this? I mean, none of us, would suggest for a second that at 2 a.m. Donald Trump put this thing together himself. I mean,
Yeah.
but are there people that we can put a name or a face to, or a group like Heritage Foundation that authored this?
So the truth is, William, I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't think it's been reported out, at least that I've seen yet, whose fingerprints are on this document. I'm gonna just throw out the idea that there's a kind of J.D. Vance slash Steve Bannon Christian nationalism that seems to be one of the threads making its way through the document. And that doesn't mean that either of them were directly involved, although it wouldn't surprise me at all if we figure out that people closely associated with them were directly involved. And yes, I do think one of the questions here would be how much were the national security agencies, the Department of Defense's military intelligence, or the State Department involved. In other words, the usual actors that would generate a document like this, or as we see with Project 2025 and then Doge, et cetera, right, that the policymaking process is in a sense being transferred out of the institutions that have the expertise to make the policy in question in order to put other priorities in place. I'm just not sure about that, William. I don't know if you'll be attending future sessions. If I find more information, I'll be happy to share it. Thank you for the good question. Jonathan, you had your hand up, right?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
When you lecture to undergraduates at Sarah Lawrence and you pause and ask for questions and comments, what sorts of questions and comments are you offered?
Oh, what an interesting question, Jonathan. And so I think the first thing to notice is that when I'm lecturing to undergraduates, I'm not giving the kind of talk that I gave here today, right? This is something that I put together for you guys. And one of the differences is I don't ask you to read anything. Right. And so when I'm teaching at Sarah Lawrence, I'm teaching primarily political philosophy. So I'm reading Rousseau with my students right now, about to start reading Kant as the semester comes to an end. And I'm asking them questions about this passage or that passage. And depending upon the students, sometimes the answers I get are really insightful, interesting interpretations of the text we're reading together. Sometimes they answer questions with questions, which is fine. And so I'm not sure why you're asking that question, Jonathan. Maybe you can give me a little bit more of the background to why you're asking that question. But it's a very different kind of conversation from the conversation we're having here today.
Thank you, David. I simply keep asking myself for insights on what much younger people think.
Yeah, so if that's what you're asking for, on the one hand, Sarah Lawrence, where I teach, is a very liberal institution. There's not a lot of sympathy for what the Trump administration is doing, if that's part of what you're asking. But then the other thing I would say, and I have to be careful here, I think my students are generally good students, but I think the cumulative effect of COVID and the way in which it disrupted a generation's educational experience, and that's still the generation I'm teaching right now. And frankly, American disinvestment in education, right? We don't have a particularly good education system in the United States right now. As a matter of fact, we don't have an education system at all. We have, right, 1,000 different school districts, many of which are struggling with meeting the basic needs of their students, let alone recruiting good teachers and providing a strong education. And then the social media environment, the environment of digital distraction, of the fracturing of attention, of people migrating away from written media and into short duration, vertically integrated videos, TikTok, right? The idea that, if it's like 15 or 20 seconds long and sexy or exciting or scary or provokes a powerful emotional response, that's the way we're training a younger generation's attention and minds. That this just is creating obstacles across higher education. It's not just me and my college, but many of us are struggling to figure out. We were trained in a literate culture, in a moment in our history where people read long and were able to muster the attention and analysis required to make your way through difficult texts, and we're finding that capacity diminished. And so yes, we're struggling somewhat in those regards. Jonathan, does that help a little bit more to think through this?
Yes, very much so. Thank you, David.
Yeah, of course. Anybody else with a thought or a question for today? All right, everybody. Be well. Have good weeks. Thank you, as always, for the opportunity to talk with you. I suspect we're going to go back to domestic politics. There is plenty to talk about with the Supreme Court and Texas redistricting and birthright citizenship going to be argued. And by the way, what's happening with the CDC and the increasing skepticism about vaccines, just many things for us to be talking about. So we'll probably pivot back in that direction, but I enjoyed the opportunity to talk about some different stuff with you today. Be well. See you next time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Take care.
David.
Yes? Oh, okay. Just saying thank you. Bye bye, guys. Take care.